So let's break it down now and move into the second part of this review. I broke this into two sections so you could take a break and maybe go back and look at the questions again. Remember, this is partial, it's not totally complete, but some of the things that we should think about when we're both taking the test and writing our essay. So let's take a look at this first question here. Why should we cite our sources? Well, this goes back on plagiarism again. We want to obviously avoid that. We want to cover our tracks, to make sure that we give credit where credit is due. So we want to be ethical in that sense. Also, we want to show in other sources that, we're not saying this, someone else is saying it, and that person may be an authority in what's being said, so that backs up what we're saying and gives more credibility to our own argument. And that way, we're being more convincing. Also, it's good to cite our sources because maybe the reader wants further information about what you said, and if you cite the source, they can go to the source and read more about it. What sort of material should be documented? Thinking about this idea. Obviously, someone else's ideas, uncommon facts, original ideas, things you take from books, quotes, things of that nature. And kind of along the same line, what are the things that what sort of material does not need to be documented? I pointed this out before, but it's good to think about this because a lot of my students, especially the international students, always like to fact check. Do I need to cite this? Do I need to back up what I'm saying on this? So some of the times where you do not need to document what you're doing is when you have common sayings, general statements, historical generalizations, usually your own ideas, unless you're quoting yourself from one of your previous works. A lot of people say that that's something you should do. I think Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world, or the ocean is deep. These things don't need to be documented. Let's take a look at this. What are some questions we should ask when we find a source that we want to use for a paper? You have a lot of the time is you're trying to figure out, you want to evaluate, what are some sources you can use? So some of the things that you want to ask is this fact or opinion? You could use fact or opinion, but it's better to have fact. But if you have an opinion, maybe you obviously have to say this person believes that, and then you put it out as that it's an opinion. How old is the source? You don't want to have sources that are very old on a subject. I mean, for some, the older sources are the only sources you have, but obviously for things that change, science, technology, you may want to, check on the more recent sources for that. Is the source an authority in the matter? Is the person that's talking about something, is that person considered an expert in the field? Or is she or he just writing a paper about something that's related, but it's not completely along the lines of his or her field of expertise? Also, is this a primary or a secondary source? Thinking about those two, what someone says about something or what the actual object is that you're discussing. A lot of the times you say, somebody said this about what someone else said about something else. A lot of the times those quotes are taken all down the line, and it's always good to trace back to who says what and when. Also, is this an internet source or a print source? Something to think about these days because it's so easy to take stuff off the internet and just cut and paste that URL. You should evaluate your sources all the time, especially the internet sources. it's harder to make print sources. So sometimes print sources are better sources. Not all the time, but to print a book is a lot harder than to just make a website. That is to say that on both the printed and the internet sources, you should check what you're doing. But sometimes a printed source in your bibliography has more credibility because it is something that's published in print. So, what's the difference between a citation and a reference? Citations are resources that are integrated into the paper, and a reference is the bibliographic information of that source that you would usually find at the end of the paper in the work cited, or sometimes it's at the bottom of the page if it's a different type of citation. So what are some sources that should be listed in italics? A lot of students are always putting things in italics or quotes, and I've seen a couple of the CLEP test questions ask about this. So think about, try to remember that books and journals and movies are going to be in italics. The larger sources, the larger, longer type things. And we think about the quotations. What are some of the things that are put in quotations? Well, those would be the articles, short stories, the shorter, essays. The shorter texts would be put in the quotations. How can you list more than 3 authors of a work? So this would be, say you've got 7 people that write an article or a book. So after the third name, you'd put E.T., next word A.L., period. And this means, and the rest. And something, I've seen one of those CLEP questions ask this. That's one of the abbreviations. We'll get to that a little bit later, but something to remember about, how things are if you've got multiple authors. What are some different reference and citation styles? I laid them out in the course here, APA, CMS, MLA. Do you have to know the difference between all of these? Not necessarily. You should review the different styles, but they have a lot in common, but there are some differences. But it's good to take a look at the different styles and, recognize the forms, how things are written out, what's used, where the date is, where the pages are, things like that, because a lot of them are different, and you want to be familiar with all of the different styles for the CLEP test. Is it important to study the abbreviations of documented sources? For the CLEP test, yes. I've seen also some of these. You should review abbreviations for bibliographic entries. Examples. I laid this out in the course, and there's a couple slides with these. You can review those. Once again, you've got other references online, and there's lists, very long lists, and it's a good idea to just review them. A couple, if you see something like DISS, what would that mean? A dissertation, no? ED, if you see ED, what would that mean? That could be editor, or it could be edition. RPT, period. That probably means reprint, no? Or maybe another one I've seen is N.D, or N period D period. So that would be no date. No date is given for that. So that might be something that you may want to review. So thinking about sources, what is the purpose of an almanac? What is the purpose of an atlas, a thesaurus, a handbook? These are different things that, when I was in college, you'd go into the library and that's where you'd get them. But now, you've got GPS and you've got the internet and you've got all these different, resources we have now online that some people may forget that, what a lot of these things are. So what is an almanac? The Farmer's Almanac, for example, is something that's pretty popular, and people look up a lot of information in it. It's a resource of a lot of different, a lot of information, from weather and etc. Almanac. Check out the Farmer's Almanac. It's got a lot of information in it, and sometimes predictions. What is an atlas? An atlas would be a list of different maps, no? I used to love looking through the atlas that I have of the different states, the different countries, the big atlas, open it up and just flip through and imagine all of these countries and places, and very, very interesting. What's a thesaurus? That would be like a synonym dictionary. Words that, have synonyms. And also in there, you usually will find antonyms, the opposite meanings. So what's a handbook? Most people know what a handbook is, but it's basically a lot of information about one subject. If you buy something, it sometimes comes with a handbook. Or if it's complex, I suppose. But a handbook would have that purpose of just one thing. What's the difference between denotation and connotation? These obviously would, like I said before, would be things you'd find in the dictionary. So denotation is the literal meaning, and the connotation is the figurative meaning. So if you have a word, I think I said before, like for example, pig. This is what a pig is. It's an animal. It's a pigsty. It's from this stock, and it's an animal of this breed, etc. But what is it? What's the connotation of a pig? Somebody that eats in a certain bad-mannered way, or a person that does other things in a negative way. What does that connote? So the difference between, and you'll find those in different meanings in the dictionary, and it's good to separate, to make sure literal versus figurative. What are some more information or abbreviations you might find in sources? This is kind of bouncing back to what we looked at a couple minutes ago, but you may see like CONJ for conjunction, MODIF period for a modifier. This would be the using of an adjective or an adverb. INTR period, what would that be? Maybe it's an intransitive verb, a verb that doesn't carry a direct object. Or SUPERL period. The superlative, the most of this, the most or the least, a superlative. PREF, would be for prefix. These are just some examples of some different abbreviations. And once again, you should go back and review them, take a look at them, and just try to be familiar with not only what the abbreviations are, but also, what are the words that they refer to. Maybe you don't know what a modifier is or a transitive verb, and you may want to look up some of those terms also. So what's framing? I like this word because it really takes home the idea of structure. Framing is when writers make readers aware of what's to come. This can be done through any type of presentation of an idea where you've got your thesis statement, this is what I'm framing what I'm going to talk about. Your topic sentence does the same thing. Your transition words do the same thing. They frame, in addition, comma, and it frames the sentence about what's going to come next. So there's different forms of framing and different complexities and different structures, but all within your paper, the framing gives you a lot of it gives you organization. There are cues about what's going to come ahead, and it really helps organize what you're saying. So let's take a look at these rhetorical devices here. So parallelism. What is a parallelism? What is alliteration? A metaphor, a simile, a hyperbole, antithesis, rhetorical question, allusion, enumeration. This is part of what you'll need to recognize in the CLEP recognition part when you take the multiple choice questions. So Yeah, a parallelism is things, obviously syntactic structures that are repeated. When you see certain words that are repeated in a certain way for creating an effect. You know, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, got some parallelism in there. Alliteration, what is alliteration? Repetition of similar sounds. So, you know, like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, or repeating the P there. Just two words sometimes, you know, 2 words, 3 words have alliteration. Peter Pan, the bus service, Peter Pan, just the 2 P's there. It really does a lot for selling a product or making a point, but the sound stands out. And a metaphor. What's a metaphor? A figurative comparison. No, like a metaphor. I'm crying a sea. Cry me a river. I live in a pigsty. And these are like metaphors to describe, using figurative language, what's going on. Simile. A simile is kind of the same thing, but it's a comparison using like or as. So it's got that simile for similar, and it's separated by like or as. And it's very, I'm tired as ... or this is like ... So that's making that comparison. Very much like a metaphor, but it's broken up by those 2 words. Hyperbole, as you may know, is exaggeration. When you're exaggerating a point, you're being hyperbolic about what you're saying. An antithesis would be like a parallel structure of ideas that contrast one another. It's not what you can do for your country. No, it's not what your country can do for you. It's what you can do for your country. You just kind of breaking it up for anti, against, and thesis. So there's 2. You have an idea and one that goes against it. They contrast each other. A rhetorical question: is this something I really need to cover? What's the important point in this? So those are rhetorical questions, because I'm just asking a question and not necessarily answering them, just kind of to set up what I'm going to talk about, or I may throw a question out and have the reader or the crowd, if you're giving a speech, you have a rhetorical question to get attention, etc. So an allusion would be a reference to a person, place, or event. You got biblical allusions, you've got allusions to common characters, maybe Superman or Batman, something that connects somebody to something that they understand. Enumeration, sometimes it's called enumeratio, but remember what this is? It's take the word number. So if you've got a number of things, you're kind of laying them out, and the reason we need to do this is because and a lot of reasons would be laid out, and this would be an enumeration of ideas. So what's the difference between using first, second, or third person? I talked about consistency in voice before, but just to bounce back on that again, first person is subjective. Third person is more objective. First person is I will show, I believe, I will explain. Third person is when you have more scientific, more objective, there's more of a distance created when you use this. Second person, very rare, but I'm reading a novel right now where the whole thing's in second person, and it says first you do this, then you go into the room, then you understand. Writing a paper in second person is not a good idea, because you don't want to say, you can see from here that we have you also can understand that. Sometimes that is laid out, you may see that, but not a recommendation for your essay. But first, second, or third person create a different effect. The second person has a great sense of immediacy. It creates a great sense of immediacy about what's going on. And in your paper, you want to be paused, you want to be structured, you want to be clear. And that second voice there may confuse things. So, looking at some common fallacies here. We have, at the end of the video, I put in a list of different ones. Ad hominem. What's ad hominem? That's when you are attacking the person instead of the argument. Another one that's common, appeal to ignorance. What is appeal to ignorance? That would be, I believe, using ignorance as evidence, you know. Like we have no evidence that something doesn't exist, therefore it must. You know, that's sometimes used in, you know, some theological arguments or arguments about, you know, experiments or different theories. So that sometimes may be something that people may fall into. Argument from authority, you know, maybe it's a false authority. You should always, you know, take a look at that. Bandwagon fallacy. Everyone does it, so it's okay, you know. Everyone's doing this, you know, like, oh, you get pulled over. Didn't you know the speed limit was 65? Yeah, but everyone's going 80. So is that logical? Well, that's an example of bandwagon. Dogmatism. That's when people don't want to consider other perspectives. Faulty analogy. What's a faulty analogy? I explained analogy a couple minutes ago, but faulty analogy. Saying two things are alike when they're actually really not alike. One with a great name that I like is the red herring, no? The red herring, diverting the attention by changing the subject. Oh yeah, look at that. Slippery slope. That's another great name there. Some of these you can remember just by their names. A change in policy that will lead to dire consequences. You know, if we do this, then this and this and this are going to happen, and then it's the end of the world. You know, so we can't do that because all of that will happen. One more here is the straw man fallacy. This is creating a false scenario and attacking it. You're attacking the straw figure rather than the real argument there. That's why I think that the word straw man was created for that one. So there's much more of this in the video, in the course. Please go back, take a look at those slides. Just wanted to run through some of them here. I hope this helped out a bit. I'm going to give you a couple of tips now on just finishing up here. So this is our conclusion of our review.